Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to this week's special episode of the Digital Law News, produced by Anson Evaluate. I'm Amelia Davies, an apprentice solicitor at Digital Law UK. I'm joined by my colleague Peter Wright, and we're just going to run through this kind of special story today. And I will pass over to Peter to introduce himself, and then we will get started.
Thanks, Amelia. My name is Peter. I'm a solicitor and the managing director at Digital Law, and we wanted to bring you some more in-depth analysis of the proposed new data protection law in the UK. So that's what we're basically devoting all of this episode to, and I'll pass over to Amelia to start taking us through.
Thanks, Peter. So starting today with an overview of kind of the big headline of changes. So first of all, we will be looking at the data protection officer changes. And so Peter, what is a data protection officer and what do they do at the moment?
So the DPO is a statutory role. It's very clearly defined within the UK Data Protection Act 2018 and GDPR, and certain key responsibilities are given to the DPO. So, for example, organisations approximately above 100 people, as it mentions in the recitals, you're supposed to have a data protection officer in place. Smaller organisations, if you've got a high volume of data or a lot of very sensitive data, should also consider having a data protection officer. And there are various organisations have put out complex flowcharts to try and guide you on the decision-making process in case you need to have a DPO. And if you do, it's then just not a matter of saying, here is a DPO. They have to have specific knowledge and skill to allow them to discharge their responsibilities under the role. You then have to make sure the information commissioner has details of who the DPO is, contact info, etc. And of course, that then means updating that information. You don't want to be in the position of going, we've had a data protection breach, and then the ICO says, well, can we speak to your DPO? And then you say, yeah, unfortunately, they left 2 years ago. So it's always important to make sure that information is properly up to date. When you add all that up, that's quite a significant regulatory burden on an organisation. So to potentially turn around and say, well, we don't need them anymore, or we don't need them under the previous criteria, is quite a significant shift. It's an even bigger shift if we wind the clock back to 2012, when the first version of GDPR was published, and that talked about all organisations having a DPO. So even a limited company with one member of staff, it would be, I'm afraid you need to have a data protection officer. So that would be the sole principal, would also be their own DPO, or would have to outsource that DPO function if they didn't have the requisite skill and knowledge and expertise. So quite a significant rollback here, and probably more significant than may at first glance be obvious.
Thanks, Peter. So that significant change will actually, to clarify, look at giving this responsibility to other senior members of staff. And kind of the position here is getting data protection into the boardroom as such to continue the conversation. I mean, this is specifically poignant when we look at, like you mentioned before, data protection breaches. If you are dealing with this in the top level, you have got that thought ingrained into people at such a high level. And I'll pass over to Peter.
No, that's absolutely right, Amelia.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting that they're saying, oh, this will mean this is properly getting data protection into the boardroom. I would be concerned that the outcome isn't that happens. It's bad enough now with that key role trying to get boards to take the issue seriously. I think without the statutory provisions around the appointment of a DPO, most companies will go, oh, great, we don't need to bother. And I don't think it will necessarily lead to the conversations at the boardroom level that you'd hope would happen. But unfortunately, that's something you'd have to regulate for, not deregulate for, which is kind of the purpose behind this. So that's their dichotomy to wrestle with.
Thanks, Peter. So our next talking point has actually come up in the news quite a few times, and this is based about cookies. So in this proposal, there is the fact that cookies will no longer need to be displayed on UK citizens' websites. And I use the specific phrasing of UK citizens there for a very specific reason. But I will just pass over to Peter to discuss in a bit more detail as to what a cookie actually is and why this is important.
So the majority of websites require the use of cookies for basic functionality, everything from just being able to tell you where your visitors have come from, what pages they've looked at, that sort of basic analytic information, all the way through to the functionality around if people can leave comments on the site, if they can place orders, if they can register for to make an inquiry or to go onto a newsletter. All of that would require the installation of a cookie on a device, and at the moment that requires a cookie banner to be on there that says accept or reject, and you have to give users that choice and then store their reply and indeed store that record of consent if it is given. The problem is that those banners have got increasingly large and complex to the point that it actually often affects the user experience of this platform to their detriment. Anyone who's gone to a site on a mobile, using a mobile device, and then find you can't actually access the site because of this huge big cookie banner that comes up, whereby it's actually sometimes impossible to then be able to scroll to the accept or reject button, or even if you do then click accept or reject, the banner doesn't disappear, to which you think, well, that was a waste of time, and promptly move on to something else. So it's become a really negative experience if you are going online using a mobile device, and the last time we looked, the majority of people go online using a mobile device. So really it's become an unintended consequence to when the Privacy and Electronic Communications regulations enacted the old European e-privacy directive, which dated back to 2002, that stipulated this had to be done. So now being able to roll this back, I think, becomes one of the... It would change people's day-to-day experience of what it's like being online. And if the government wants to be able to turn around and say, look, we've left the EU and here's a big benefit, this is an easier one to achieve than a lot of the other more difficult things to try and demonstrate having left the EU. So it's become, in some circles, the EU cookie law, as it's termed, has become quite a totemic issue. So it's one reason why to sort of include this clause, these proposals in this consultation, is very much sort of red meat to a certain section of the country as a result.
So looking at kind of the cookie changes themselves, this will now mean that cookies are put onto your browser as in an opt-out basis. Therefore, as a consumer, you don't actually give your immediate consent. What they are hoping to look at doing is providing information to users kind of in bulk to allow users to understand how their information is being collected, to move away from the sort of tick box exercise like you mentioned, Peter, because people simply see these come up on their screens and are like, oh my goodness, yet another one. Click the accept, don't read it, and go on and look at the website or whatever you're doing. Whereas this is when you're having to look at it in an opt-out basis. At least then if people are concerned about their data, they will have a chance to take a look at this bulk lot of information and decide how they want to approach this. And so looking at another change that has been proposed is looking at data protection impact assessments. And this is something that we actually carry out ourselves, isn't it, Peter? So I will pass over to you to explain in more detail what a data protection impact assessment is and what this means.
Indeed. So at the moment, it's mandated that if a major new aspect is being carried out in terms of something that involves the collection of personal data, so for example, if as a business you decide, right, we'll set up a new website, or you're going to have a new app, or you're going to carry out a certain function. So for example, say putting on a big conference or an event where you're going to be collecting a large volume of personal data, you should be carrying out a data privacy impact assessment, which is probably news to a lot of people, but that's what the law currently says. So at the moment, there is about a 40-page code of conduct on the ICO's website that says this is what a data privacy impact assessment looks like. There is a free tool that you were able to download from CNIL, the French data protection regulator's website. They have this free online tool that you could use to carry out a DPIA, or you can ask people to undertake it for you. So we do this for some of our clients to actually carry this out to identify any risks around the collection of data and what should then be done to minimize that risk. And that's very much what the data privacy impact assessment does. It's a clear mandated form of quite detailed risk assessment to highlight the problems around the collection of data and what you're going to do to reduce those risks. The key here is to encourage flexibility. So it's basically saying you need to look at the risks, but it doesn't say you have to carry out a DPIA. So the proposal is to sort of have greater flexibility. The danger, though, is when you say greater flexibility, it means then that people don't actually properly identify the risks. Surely if you need to identify the risks at the moment, the way of saying, well, you do that by actually having carried this exercise out, so you can demonstrate to the regulator, this is what we've identified and what we've done about it, is quite a neat way of doing it. If you're then saying, well, actually, we aren't looking for a DPIA, but we're just looking for you to give us evidence, well, what's that going to look like? How detailed should it be? So I think that's actually going to be potentially more of a challenge for some organisations to try and gauge, well, what is it that you expect from us? Because it's becoming even less prescriptive and even more open-ended. Basically, you'd be looking at saying, we want you to give us evidence that you've thought about this, but we're not telling you what we expect you to have done. It's almost like sort of then if you've not done what they expect, you can say, well, gotcha, you didn't do that, did you? And you say, well, but you didn't tell us what you were expecting. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword there, potentially.
You mentioned the regulator quite a few times there, and that moves us nicely onto our next point. So the ICO are going to be given greater enforcement powers under this kind of new law, and they are kind of looking at making the ICO more approachable and more flexible in their approach. And so there's a fair amount to unpack there, so I will pass over to Peter.
Yes, so that wonderful word flexible runs through this whole draft bill and consultation exercise, like Seaside Blackpool Rock, where it just says flexibility all the way through it, but doesn't necessarily tell you what they mean by flexible, but it sounds great. And in here they're sort of saying, oh, well, we're actually going to give the ICO more powers to enforce, and it'll be more of a flexible approach. Though it doesn't really say what those powers are going to be. I mean, they can already fine potentially hundreds of millions of pounds in fines, and indeed that's exactly what was proposed against British Airways and Marriott back in 2019, of course, by the UK ICO. But perhaps this is therefore saying, well, we aren't just going to have the big stick of being able to charge huge fines. We're also going to have the power to perhaps be able to order compliance, perhaps to sort of do an unless approach, to say, unless you carry out the actions that we are requesting that you do. So, for example, to go and delete some data that you shouldn't have collected, or delete some data that's been retained for far longer than it should have been. You could sort of say, unless you do that, then we will take further action, which would be a more sort of commercial and pragmatic way to approach it. But you'd still, of course, then have to have the big stick in the background of saying, if you don't comply with that, we'll then come back and potentially fine you a horrific amount. Not to mention the negative publicity of facing enforcement from the data protection regulator in the first place. So probably, yes, it's a good thing that they'd be getting greater enforcement powers, but let's actually see what we mean by that. I think that's going to be the key here. And if they're waiting for the great British public to tell them in the form of a consultation response, I'd have a few concerns about that, I think.
And our last point, while it's not something we're going to look at in much detail today, it is still worth mentioning. This is looking at breach responses. So as part of the consultation, they were looking at kind of minimizing the breaches and only looking at those that pose a material risk to individuals. So this is kind of looking at what did and did not need to be reported. However, after the consultation, too many people essentially said, well, we're not really happy with this, because the amount of information that can be taken when even a minor breach is reported is actually a considerable amount. And therefore, there's not going to be any radical changes here, aside from the fact the ICO are going to produce clearer guidance in relation to data breaches and reporting. So I'll pass over to Peter to kind of go through that in a bit more detail.
Thanks, Amelia. I mean, this is quite an interesting proposal, because at the moment the idea is that if there is a data protection breach, it should be reported, which has meant that the ICO benefits from a lot more data than it previously had. To roll that back and say, well, it's actually you've got to only be material breaches, and then to define what material means becomes, I think, a little bit more of a challenge. And also it could mean that the ICO actually then receives less data. At the moment, even if it receives information about a breach and their response is to go, yeah, great, thank you for telling us that, no need to take any further action. at least they've got the data of what the breach was, what happened, what was done to remedial action was taken. It gives them data and touch points about what's happening out there in the real world, even if they then don't follow up with any further investigatory function. And that, to a certain extent, I think has been quite helpful for the ICO. And if you're not then getting that volume of reported information, does that hinder your ability to properly consider policy making further down the line? It also means that whereas it's pretty similar for all of the data protection regulators across Europe, whereby they are being able to get this large amount of data in terms of what sort of breaches are being reported and take action accordingly, that the UK ICO would then be setting itself apart from other data protection regulators, certainly in Europe. And that may end up having an impact further down the line. And we're going to talk about adequacy later, but this will be one of the things that might lead to an issue when it comes to that adequacy decision. But in theory, this reduces the burden on organisations to say you don't have to report everything. And the overall thrust of these changes is very much deregulation. Let's say that almost a feeling that GDPR is the sledgehammer to crack a walnut, and that for a lot of organisations we can roll back some of these requirements and make it so that the cost of compliance and the cost of the regulatory burden that organisations are operating under is reduced. But given that we've just done a sort of whistle-stop flying tour through the main issues, you've got to stop and think, well, hang on, is that going to deliver the savings in terms of that regulatory burden? And will it help companies to function more efficiently by not doing these things? Or is it going to change things radically between what is the case in Europe versus the UK, but not really deliver much in the way of savings to make it worthwhile? And that's going to be the very difficult path that the government now has to follow, having sort of staked out these positions. That sounds great. Are you going to maintain them, or are you going to roll them back, as they've done with so many things over the last 3 years? Think about planning reform, think about taxes, think about all the things they say, yes, we're going to do that. And then when it comes to actuality, they go, actually, no, we aren't actually going to do that after all. We're going to water it down, and we're just going to do these small things rather than these big things that we at first proposed. And if that is the case, there's nothing particularly ambitious in these proposals. And if you are going to water them down, it almost becomes, well, what's the point? You know, if the only thing that you get from this is getting rid of cookie banners, was it really worth all that parliamentary time and review? Maybe it is. And this is a discussion point. After all, this is a consultation exercise that has been issued. So, but I think we have to sort of look at a little bit of cost benefit on all of this as well.
Thanks, Peter. So looking at kind of the context surrounding this, why has the reform come about now? It's been 4 years since GDPR. We have left the EU. What does kind of this mean for us?
So I think this really comes down to the fact that data protection reform is one of the easier levers for the government to pull to demonstrate that something's happening now that the UK has left the European Union. Don't forget that technically the UK left the EU while the pandemic was still in full flow. So there wasn't immediately a change. And while there have been problems with trade, it's not really clear how much of that can be attributed to Brexit or how much of that can be attributed to supply chain problems following the pandemic, and how much of it can be applied to problems related to the war in the Ukraine and now the rising cost of inflation. So trade is clearly in a bit of a mess all over the world at the moment, not just in the UK. So it's very difficult to be able to say, well, a particular issue is wholly attributable to Brexit. So when you've got all these complexities, suddenly it's tempting to say, well, how can we get a quick win to show that there is a clear outcome here that would not have happened if we were still in the EU? And for example, this is where getting rid of cookie banners and some of the other changes in here are an easier thing to be able to demonstrate compared to some of the more very complex and difficult things that now you can say, well, we've got regulatory freedom to do this, but actually shoving that through Parliament in the remaining 2 and a bit years of this Parliament that are left is actually rather easier said than done. You'd also think that something like changes to data protection law, that while people who are excited about privacy get very, very excited and irate about these things, the vast majority of people probably really couldn't care less. So it's less contentious. The likelihood of you getting hundreds of MPs saying this is absolutely monstrous and we are going to support it is pretty unlikely. So, it's something that the government might think, well, we can put this through, and it's not as though we're going to face rebels from our own side who aren't going to vote against it, and we shouldn't have too many issues against us in it. So it becomes a sort of a low-hanging fruit, easier thing to achieve. So I think that's very much why this was in the Queen's speech this year and why this draft bill has been put forward. So that's kind of, I think, why this is happening now.
I think as well, it's probably worth mentioning here the National Cyber Strategy. This is something that we had previously spoken of a few months back, Peter, and I think definitely here it is worth mentioning that potentially from the underlying pressure of the pandemic, where tech innovation and innovation in relation to getting vaccines produced so quickly, looking at reforming the Data Protection Act and the fact that it could mean that innovation in tech in the UK certainly could advance far sooner than going through the more rigorous regulations of the EU, which is certainly something that was reflected in the National Cybersecurity Strategy, because it was all about, I hate to use the term, but levelling up.
That's absolutely right. So that you've got the cyber strategy and the data strategy, which are both things that have sort of referred to that level of element of levelling up, and therefore it all comes back to the fact that yes, these are things that can be put through that are slightly easier to achieve than some of the more complex things. That doesn't say that it's necessarily low cost. I mean, let's face it, you bring in these changes, there will be a knock-on regulatory effect. There will be an impact on how the ICO functions, and there could be furthermore a knock-on impact in terms of the relationship between Europe and the UK when it comes to sharing data, which we'll be talking about later. But again, it comes to that word adequacy. So these are all issues that do have to be quite carefully weighed up as a result.
Thanks, Peter. And so what is the reform set out to actually achieve? We've spoken about kind of the key sticking points and kind of the context of this, but what are we actually trying to achieve here in changing the Data Protection Act?
Very good question. I think one of the things is that it's a way of showing divergence, a way of showing, look, the laws are now different compared to for technology and data compared to what they are in the EU. So actually satisfying what you just said, Amelia, about being able to say, well, look, the regulatory environment for research, innovation, handling data, potentially applications for AI is different in the UK, and to say, look, there's less of a regulatory burden. Companies looking to invest should come to the UK rather than the EU. That's kind of been, for the last 10 years, there's been this term Singapore on Thames, the idea of sort of turbocharging the British economy as a low-regulated haven on the edge of the hyper-regulated EU on the continent. But little measures like this aren't going to deliver Singapore on Thames anytime soon, if it is even achievable. And it's also the fact that, so you're demonstrating divergence. In theory, you're also delivering savings, though I'd say that is in theory. And I think it's quite difficult to quantify the size of that saving. We aren't talking about saying you no longer have to worry about data protection compliance. So organizations will still have to have, training and assessment for staff when it comes to data protection compliance. They will still have to think of what the law says when it comes to collecting and processing and storing personal data. That it's not as though we're getting rid of that. That's where the big regulatory costs are involved and the regulatory burdens are involved. So I think you and I have both heard presentations where people said this will save billions, and you're thinking, really, changing the nature of the DPO role and doing away with compulsory DPIAs, is that going to save billions? That's the question. So in theory, it delivers savings to business. In theory, it gives the ICO more powers when it comes to enforcement. And And again, in theory, it delivers this wonderful word, flexibility and agility, to say, look, we've got a better regulatory environment for technology, data research and innovation. So those are sort of the potential things that this might achieve, but that is all heavily caveated with the words potential and might.
Thanks, Peter. I think you could also mention here the fact that looking at kind of startup businesses and SMEs, would it be looking at making less hoops for them to jump through, do you think? Or do you think the changes will actually result in a bit more confusion here?
It might do. And I think there is one laudable aim here, which is to say that if you are a UK organisation that is not doing business overseas, to basically say, look, you therefore shouldn't have to worry about complying with everything that GDPR demands. And that's always been, I think, one of the frustrating things about GDPR to an outsider looking in, to say that, look, if you're running a cafe on a high street and you might operate a website so that people can pre-order their coffee or that you can have coffee delivered somewhere, you're having to jump through all of these international data protection compliance requirements. And I think the aspiration to say, if you are sort of operating a bootstrap business like that, you don't have to comply with all of these things. That's going to be a bonus, you know. So if you're running a cafe or a bakery, or particularly things like leisure and hospitality, or say you run a little business that, you know, installs people's windows or installs garage doors for businesses, whatever it could be. If it's reducing the burden for the SME sector, and in particular, as you say, Amelia, for startups, where, let's face it, I think they'd love to be able to put all their resources into building the business rather than worrying about regulatory compliance, that would be a good thing. But bear in mind that a lot of the proposals here don't remove things like the need to have demonstration, to being able to demonstrate data protection by design. You've still got to demonstrate that. And at the moment, the best way of doing that is through a DPIA. So you might say, well, you don't have to do a DPIA, but you'd still have to demonstrate data protection by design somehow. Now, one of the problems we very often have is sitting down with startups and those who've got these great ideas and say, well, that's great, but in order to, you'll save yourself an awful lot of time and worry if you think about the data protection compliance issues now and build that into your IT infrastructure as part of the architecture at the outset, rather than stampeding ahead to do the exciting stuff like building an IT system and building an app and getting a website up and running, and then later on going, oh, how do we actually make sure that we're now complying with what the law says, and then actually having to potentially, at far greater cost and expense, trying to retrofit a solution. So, you know, because we're only really looking at fairly cosmetic changes here, the really big ticket stuff is still something that you'll have to do. If anything, the worry here is that people think, oh, we don't have to worry about data protection and GDPR anymore, when the reality is you do. And don't forget that if you're going to be working in processing the personal data of EU citizens and exporting goods and services into the EU market, which a lot of organisations do, you're still going to have to comply with GDPR in full, regardless of what these proposals say, because if you're then operating in Europe, you'll have to apply by Europe's rules of its playground. So, yes, there are savings for that SME and startup sector, but it's potentially actually a little bit more complex to exchange to organisations that are doing business overseas being just across the channel. The fact that actually, yeah, you've now got to comply with what's in the UK and also in the EU as well.
So focusing on the ICO as a regulator here, how will the government kind of give new powers to the ICO, and what is this, do you think, going to look like in practice? Because we've heard throughout that this consultation, the government have worked really closely with the ICO to make sure that we are getting that correct balance. And there is supposed to be a new understanding of powers and collaboration, but have we got any sort of idea of how the government are actually going to give these powers to the ICO and what they might look like in practice? Because there is this whole thing, it's all about looking at in practice instead of on paper, moving away from GDPR.
The short answer to that question is no. So we don't know necessarily what those new powers would look like, and we don't know how you'd be looking to change the approach. of how the regulator approaches their regulatory task and achieving their objectives. Already, I'd say that the ICO is a more conciliatory, proactive, practical regulator than an awful lot of other regulators who are out there. You know, you can contact them, you can talk to them, and you can ask for, I mean, they won't give you advice, but they will try and give you as much practical help and support as they can, which is a different approach to a lot of other regulators who are all sort of, well, we aren't going to tell you what we want you to do. We're just going to tell you when we think you haven't done it and possibly fine you. So they're a lot more pragmatic than some. So already, you know, they have that sort of better approach. It's already there. It's not as though this is going to introduce that. Already, it's kind of in a better place than it is for some of the other regulators out there. When you look at different sectors of the economy, so really, it's at the moment difficult to see how this will vary the existing relationship. We don't know what those new powers will be, and we don't necessarily know what that change in approach will be. But again, it sounds incredibly flexible.
So going and looking at the collaboration here, you've mentioned how the ICO already appear to be doing better than some of the other regulators. And this next point kind of builds on that, is the fact that they will be collaborating with other regulators within the tech sector. So looking at the ICO collaborating with the FCA, so that's the Financial Conduct Authority, as well as Ofgem and other providers. What sort of impact could that have?
This could actually be incredibly positive. Where if you've got the ICO working with, you know, Competition and Markets Authority, who deal with regulating all of the mergers and acquisitions and things, which of course can involve merging of data sets, customer information, or, you know, working with the FCA, Financial Conduct Authority, financial services, of course, that's huge amounts of personal data, and very sensitive personal data often there as well as other regulators that are out there. Having that sort of regulatory cooperation forum is, from a practical perspective, really positive. And it will be interesting to see if you get more practical advice, guidance and support from the ICO as a result. Bear in mind that their sort of multilateral approach in the past has been to work with other European Union data protection regulators. So the ICO used to be on the European Data Protection Board. Post-Brexit, it isn't, though I think we're allowed to sit outside and occasionally go in and say hello before then being asked to leave for a lot of the discussions that take place at the European Data Protection Board. Yes, it's helpful to speak to other regulators, data protection regulators, about their approach, but in terms of the actual benefits to potentially business and the economy, the fact that you've got the data protection regulators speaking to those other key sector regulators actually would produce better guidance and support and a better regulatory outcomes potentially. So actually this is one big benefit, is the idea of that greater level of cooperation across different regulators. So for example, Ofcom, who are the ones dealing with a lot of the things like, you know, things that are published and said online, or advertising and things. Don't forget that so much advertising now takes place on social media, where there are then issues around storage and processing of personal data. You can very easily see how both of those fit hand in hand, hand in glove together. So the fact that we'll get more cooperation between these organisations has to be a good thing. And I think if you then get uniform requirements on organisations in terms of this is what we expect from you, that has to be a positive thing.
Thanks, Peter. So moving on to a specific article of GDPR now. This is Article 22. And this is related to automated decision making. And there is a lot of complexity here and interpretations which allow for a lot of ambiguity. And so in this, we are hoping to kind of clear this up and look at safeguards and how we should be correctly applying this in practice. This is kind of quite a big amendment here, and it will lead us on nicely to look at the white paper in relation to AI. But first of all, Peter, can you just kind of unpack what automated decision making is and why it's so important here?
So increasingly we get more automated decision making that takes place in relation to personal data because of the sheer volume that's collected. So if you can use an algorithm to assist in the processing of that data. Even if it isn't necessarily making decisions, if it's guiding decision makers and giving a easier way to understand a large volume of data, that kind of helps when it comes to the functioning of large-scale processes and then supporting the operations of business as a result. There has been a new AI regulation is sort of formulating and being introduced in Europe that, of course, will not apply to the UK. This is only, in terms of Article 22, it's only talking about automated decision making and AI when it comes to personal data. So if we aren't talking about personal data, all of this would fall away, I hasten to add. But this actually is one of the benefits whereby you could potentially be hopefully lessening the burden on those who are engaging in automated decision making, potentially using AI, and mean that they can get on with doing that innovation and worrying a little bit less about data protection outcomes as a result of this. So the idea here is that you would be amending that Article 22 of GDPR, restructuring it so there is greater clarity on how and when businesses need to take account of it, and also to hopefully build up greater public trust in that automated decision making. Bear in mind that we've seen sort of the occasional horror story of profiling from security cameras, that they've attempted to sort of use automated decision making to work out if a individual, for example, is present in a crowd or if they present a threat. And sometimes, of course, it's ended up making automated decisions based on perceived race, ethnicity, gender, which were actually unfounded. But that can be one of the problems when you're looking at sifting such large volumes of data, that then you can get these sort of prejudices baked in. Another problem identified was in a similar way when AI was being used for some decision making by insurers and potentially in pilots that were undertaken when it came to automated decision making in jurisdictions overseas, I hasten to add, when it came to certain functions of both the criminal and civil justice systems. So they did different tests in America, and unfortunately they found out that if you fed in judgments that had been made by human judges on previous cases that, of course, would have been subject to certain biases, that bias would then be perpetuated in the way that algorithm would then operate in future, which isn't necessarily, well, it is not ideal, let's put it that way. It is highly suboptimal for that to be the case. So I think there has been an effect for the public in terms of their faith in the potential viability of things like automated decision making in those sorts of functions, and generally a feeling that people are like, well, we'd rather stick with what we've got, thank you. At least we can then criticise the decision of a human being or appeal it, rather than just being given a decision by a machine and told to lump it and get on with it. So let's hope that this would lead to greater public trust, because the direction of travel is, it is inevitable we're going to get more automated decision making, particularly in the delivery of a lot of the services that we rely on. We're talking about greater automated decision making in things like public transport. Don't forget, we've had automated trains in the UK for 40 years. They've been operating, if you've ever got on the Docklands Light Railway in London, guess what? That's driverless. So passengers can sit at the front and enjoy the view rather than drivers. Now, there's no reason why that couldn't be the case on the rest of the train network. That's one of the reasons why we've got issues with regards to industrial relations on trains and public transport at the moment, because, of course, that leads to a big variation in the sort of work that people have been asked to do in the past. But certainly, most of the London Underground trains are pretty much fully automated. There's just a human being sat there just to make sure that nothing untoward should happen, and just pressing the occasional button. So we're seeing that level of automated decision making to handle very complex operations being used in utilities that we use on a virtually daily basis. And the idea, hopefully, is that this sort of level of automated decision making would be more streamlined through the proposals that are being suggested here for under Article 22. Again, I think we'll need more detail to see exactly how that works in practice.
We've streamlined us very nicely there into my next point here. This is looking at the AI white paper that is hoping to be published. So there is no kind of date set for this. However, looking at the landscape that you've just talked about there, they are mindful that this does need to come out soon to kind of interchange and interlock with this consultation. And it will actually be quite interesting to see after this white paper has been published, any sort of powers that the ICO will be given as a regulator to deal with automated decision making and AI, because this is something that hasn't really been regulated in the UK before due to how tech has just moved on. So this is another thing where we're looking at the innovation here, and potentially you mentioned that the EU have been looking at legislating on this. However, because we are now not a part of that, we can make our own legislation that might lead to further innovation in relation to AI and automated decision making in the future. But it's at the moment very dependable on what this unpublished AI white paper is set to see. So moving on then to the A word that Peter has mentioned throughout this, and this is adequacy. I won't even try and introduce this, Peter. I'll hand straight on over to you.
Okay, so adequacy is the mechanism by which the personal data of EU citizens is allowed to be transferred to the United Kingdom. So for an awful lot of data processing that doesn't differentiate between UK and EU users, it's pretty essential. If you didn't have that adequacy, the principle is you couldn't have a free flow of data from Europe. Instead, you'd have to rely on other mechanisms like the standard contractual clauses in international data transfer agreements, or things like binding corporate rules, which allow the transfer of personal data within a company or within a corporate group of companies. So adequacy has sort of smoothed the wheels of commerce, having been granted in the wake of the UK's departure from the European Union. The process was actually quite long-winded to get the adequacy decision for the United Kingdom, which, given that the UK was a member of the EU for 40 years and a leader in establishing data protection law, does kind of beg the question that, well, if the UK can't get adequacy, then frankly, who can? But the concern was that because of the UK government's surveillance practices, we have GCHQ, the government's listening post, and a lot of government surveillance that's undertaken, as well as then that information being shared through the Five Eyes security network, whereby the UK shares data in relation to intelligence with the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. There was the concern, therefore, that because of these security practices, that the UK wouldn't get an adequacy decision. But it did, and therefore the UK joins the list along with Japan and Canada and New Zealand and several other countries. I think about a dozen countries now that have got adequacy decisions from the European Commission. The United States is not on that list, and we won't even go into that rabbit hole today. But the fact remains that we have the adequacy decision. But of course, that is subject to an assessment that was carried out as to the UK's data protection laws, as well as its security and surveillance laws, at the point when the adequacy decision was granted, which was in 2021. Now, problem is, the UK changes its data protection laws subject to this new data bill, then you'd be looking at potentially making the UK go through that process again, and then it's not definite that the UK would necessarily get an adequacy decision at the end of that exercise, and that is kind of the risk that is ever present in the background of this whole exercise, that you might be able to lead to some deregulation here and deliver some good benefits, but if you end up sort of as you shuffle towards one end of the ledge and sort of being able to do that, but at the other end you're sort of falling off and that data adequacy decision is lost, you're then potentially delivering far more regulatory burden on organisations, because then they'll have to do those international data transfer agreements, and they'll have to have signed, audited standard contractual clauses on those contracts, and that could make things very problematic. It's not as though the adequacy decision is set in stone, though. It was time limited, and it's the only time limited adequacy decision the European Commission's ever made. So it was always the case, I think, that the EU Commission was going to look again at the UK's data protection laws. So that this was always going to happen. And it's just a matter of how far the Department of Culture, Media and Sport thinks it can actually push the envelope when trying to introduce some of these deregulatory changes. I think the other thing to bear in mind here as well is we've talked about the likelihood of change, and I should actually also add that the Department of Culture, Media and Sport is probably the busiest one in the government at the moment, because it's going to look at potentially selling off Channel 4. It's looking at the renegotiation of the Royal Charter for the British Broadcasting Corporation. It's carrying out a lot of different changes, even down to things like getting rid of the license fee for the BBC, which they've talked about. So all of these things roll it together, and actually it's a very busy department, a lot of things that need to happen, and that could mean, if there's political will to put through this new data bill, great, but it also means that it could end up being flattened behind some of those more high-profile things, like selling off Channel 4, which has already become a very contentious issue as far as the government is concerned. So that adequacy decision is crucial to this. It is to be hoped that adequacy decision can be maintained. If it isn't, any savings that could be delivered to business and the economy through the deregulation in the data bill will pretty much be dwarfed by the massive increase in regulatory costs that a lack of an adequacy decision with the European Union would entail.
I think it's worth mentioning here, though, despite obviously the fact that adequacy is so contentious, the EU Commission has been involved in the drafting of this, and they cannot guarantee adequacy status, but they have been engaged on official levels in relation to this. And once the final paper has been approved, the EU Commission will get a copy of it first so that we can get any feedback as soon as possible. And while the government are mentioning that they are fairly confident that the reform outlines are not going to tip us over the edge of adequacy, it does remain to be seen. But I do think it's worth kind of thinking about here that the EU Commission is aware of what's going on. Whatever they think behind closed doors is another question. However, they are aware.
Yes, I think the main concern, though, is that relations between the UK and the EU are not exactly great at the moment. And there's this running sore of the Northern Ireland Protocol, which is the land border between the Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and that has never been properly settled. It's been a contentious issue. The UK has been talking about passing laws unilaterally to vary the terms of the protocol that was agreed with the European Union. And it's getting to the point that relations, therefore, between the UK and the EU are very, very bad. And if it was to become even more contentious, one of the ways that you could then ramp up those tensions would be by, for example, the EU withdrawing its adequacy decision and saying, well, if you're going to go ahead with that, we will no longer give you adequacy, in a sort of escalation tit for tat playground. He said this, she said that, so-and-so pulled my hair. Really? Well, so-and-so kicked me. That's kind of the playground level that we're at, sadly, and this could be part of that potential escalation, regardless of the best efforts of the civil servants at the Department of Culture, Media and Sport to make sure that this passes easily and that it doesn't threaten the adequacy decision. Also, just because so far the European Commission has said, yes, we're perfectly happy with this, they could just as easily then turn around and change their mind at the 11th hour.
So it sounds there that you're sort of alluding to the fact that divergence could be more complex in relation to the EU and UK law. But the goal is to avoid sort of double compliance. But you seem to have a little bit of a juxtaposition there going on. If we're avoiding double compliance, but then if the UK and EU citizens have to be treated differently, is that not double compliance?
Exactly. That's the problem here. In theory, the idea of you know, oh, the UK can separate from the EU and we can have our own laws and our own regulatory structure and we can do this and we can do that. Sounds great on paper. This area of data protection is just one that shows how, in practice, these issues are far more difficult and complex. And it's kind of showing that even fairly small regulatory divergence of the type contemplated in this bill could have significant, a much bigger impact on, you know, through potentially losing an adequacy decision than may at first be apparent. And it's the same case in multiple sectors of the economy, where it's almost like you have to take 2 steps back to take 1 step forward. Doesn't mean it isn't worth doing it, and it doesn't mean that in the long run, 10 to 15 years, you could end up with a radically different regulatory settlement in the UK, and there could be discernible differences in how the economy is functioning, and you could get that sort of sunlit upland of much greater research and development, investment and innovation in the UK as a result. But it's getting there and starting that path to divergence, while not at the same time prejudicing your existing trading relationships. That's the problem, and that's sort of the Gordian knot that we have. And this is an attempt to try and achieve that divergence, but as you quite rightly say, Amelia, the problem is, what if you suddenly end up finding that, well, we've got certain costs that we've got to meet in order to comply with the UK Data Act, and then, oh, actually, we've then got to also comply with GDPR. That's always going to be the occupational problem. But I mean, by the same token, we advise clients that end up operating in multiple different jurisdictions. So recently we were helping one client that operates in Europe. We were telling them, if you want to operate in the UK, this is what you'll have to do. Don't forget that even though there is GDPR in Europe, it doesn't mean it's the same GDPR in all countries. So for some of our clients, you've had to say, in France, you've got to do this. In Spain, you've got to do that. In Portugal, you've got to do that. In the UK, the law of the land is this. If you're going to go to America, you've got to think about the California Consumer Privacy Act and the California Privacy Rights Act. All of these things together mean that there is always that regulatory cost to doing business in multiple different jurisdictions, and that will continue to be the case. At least there is that potential benefit of saying, if you aren't operating internationally, and like we were saying, if you're operating a little cafe somewhere or something in the, say, the leisure and hospitality industry, then you don't potentially have to jump through the hoops that you do currently have to do. But it comes down to the benefits of freeing up that sector versus the negatives of the problems with the adequacy decision. And that's why it just comes down to the fact that these issues, as I say, are far more complex than I think was originally envisaged.
That leads us very nicely onto our next point. So when we were introducing the overview here, we looked at cookies and the immediate attention the removal of cookies has received. And so this is kind of a main point throughout this consultation. And the removal of cookie banners does specifically relate to UK citizens. There is very specific wording here. And this again looks at the point that you just mentioned, Peter, the fact that while businesses operating purely in the UK, like in the hospitality sector, you've got a cafe and your website, you might not need to have cookies because you aren't operating outside of the UK. But say you are Costa or another big brand, you are going to have to still provide consent because you are operating outside of the UK. And this nicely actually links back into the AI comment that you have made before. So when I introduced this, I looked at the you'd have to opt out when you are looking at cookies. You no longer give your consent. Whereas in the future, it could be that you have an AI extension to your browser that automatically kind of blocks any cookies that you do not want. However, again, this is a bit of a pie in the sky because we don't have the AI white paper, and at the moment, this does not exist. So when we're looking at the opt-out scheme, it is a matter of, at the moment, the cookies that are put on your device without consent are kind of very small cookies that don't really mean a lot, whereas in the future, this could be changed. So we are in a bit of a limbo here still in relation to these. So I will pass over to Peter to continue explaining this one.
Indeed, Amelia, I think limbo is the right word for it. there is the benefit of no longer having the, as you say, the cookie banners for everyone. But in terms of what you'll replace it with, it's not very clear. And we aren't the first ones to have struggled with this. The European Union's been wanting to replace the requirement to have accept and reject cookie buttons, banners on websites. They've been working to replace that for the best part of a decade. They were supposed to be introducing an e-privacy regulation at the same time that GDPR was coming in, that would have also dealt with communications and would have dealt with cookies and cookie banners and web browsers. And instead, they wanted to have it taken care of through the privacy settings on individual browsers on devices rather than via banners. But the whole thing became so difficult and complex and has been subjected to so much lobbying that e-privacy regulation, which was supposed to be drafted and agreed and settled and come in at the same time as GDPR, is still a piece of draft legislation and is no closer to becoming law now in Europe than it was when GDPR came in, both when it was passed by the Parliament in 2016 and when it was introduced in 2018. So there's always been this problem that you're supposed to have both of these bits of legislation coming in at the same time, using the same enforcement mechanism, I hasten to add. So you would have still had your massive multi-million euro fines for breaches of the privacy regulation as well. So there should have been no incongruity there. It should have been all very, very clear. That's not, of course, what's happened. And the fact that Europe's not been able to agree on what you replace the cookie banners with is kind of what they're running across the problem with here in the UK now. They're saying, well, okay, it won't be opt-in, it'll be opt-out instead, and we're going to do it through web browsers. But there's an element here of, again, that the sort of automated processing of data and how this information will properly be collected, stored and processed. That means there's still an element where we're going to have to wait and see exactly what's in the detail in due course. So it's almost like the aspiration may be a good one, to say, yes, we're not going to have to worry about these things. And instead, we're going to have much clearer rules around opting out rather than opting in. But we're still going to have to see more about the actual nuts and bolts of how this is going to be achieved.
Thanks, Peter. And we've spoken a lot about kind of the bill itself, but one thing we've not mentioned is when is this likely to be introduced? And so at the moment, there isn't an exact date for this, but it was mentioned in the Queen's speech. And therefore, it could be implied that it will be introduced in this year's parliamentary session. And therefore, it would maybe look at becoming kind of a new bill in next spring. However, this would mean that the bill would need to be introduced fairly soon in order for this to happen.
Yes, that's right. I mean, there's nothing definite at the moment, no clear timetable. It is not clear how much effort the government will put to actually getting this passed. And I've already talked about the fact that the UK Department of Culture, Media and Sport, which is the department pushing these reforms through, is very, very busy with a lot of different plates spinning on a lot of different sticks at the moment that it's hoping to achieve before the end of this Parliament. Nonetheless, data reform is one of the easier things to achieve and one of the easier things to be able to demonstrate to people, look, we've left the EU and here are some positive benefits than some of those other things. So I think, it was read out in the Queen's speech. I think the aspiration and the political will to try and get this done before the next UK election, which is due in December of 2024, don't forget. I think the likelihood is that this is, given that we had the Queen's speech, when was it now? 23rd of June. It was last month. In May, we had the Queen's speech. I think it is intended that we'll have a fairly long final parliamentary session. It could be anything up to sort of 18 months long with a lot of these sort of bills incorporated in it. We might not see a proper piece of legislation ready to go through both houses until potentially later this year, early next year. But I think it is reasonable to think that we'd see this going through both houses and being passed before the next election. because it goes back to being something that the government can point to and say, look, we stood in 2019 and we said that we would get Brexit done. Not only have we got it done, we can now show you some of the benefits. Look, you no longer have to click accept or reject on cookie banners. Isn't that good? So that would be the aim. And that's one of the reasons why I think they might want to try and get this through within the next 2 years. But also be mindful of the fact that, sadly, this government has developed a reputation for promising the earth and then failing to achieve it. So this all sounds good at the moment. You know, it was in the Queen's speech, and now we've got a draft bill, and we've got a consultation, got lots of things happening. But what will actually make it through into a final piece of draft legislation, and will the political impetus to get this done remain? At the moment, I'd say yes, we will, but you never know if something else might supersede it in the intervening months.
Thanks, Peter, and that's a great end to our discussion today. So big thank you to Anson Evaluate for helping to produce this webinar, and we will be back next week with probably a more of a run-of-the-mill sort of news podcast. Just a reminder that these episodes are available on our website, YouTube channel, podcast channels as well, such as Spotify, Amazon and Apple Music. Thank you for listening, and we hope to see you again next week.